Adobe Camera Raw, or images shot in Camera Raw, are the closest thing you can get to a digital negative. I've launched Adobe Bridge and I'm in the Lesson 7 Beautiful Images folder, and I'm going to slide up the preview to show you what's contained here. I have an image that was shot on an iPhone, and it's JPEG. If I double-click that, it automatically opens Photoshop. I'll close this window, and I'll hit Command-Tab or Alt-Tab to come back to Adobe Bridge. Instead of double-clicking and using Photoshop's tools to do color correction, you've been able to do Camera Raw adjustments since I believe version CS2 or CS3. To force a JPEG or a TIFF, something that wasn't originally shot in RAW, to open in Camera Raw, you simply go to Adobe Bridge, select the image, and choose File, Open in Camera Raw. And then you'll see the awesome and powerful Camera Raw interface. I don't do anything to an image without opening it up or doing simple corrections on it first in Camera Raw. I probably did this without telling you, but first I went to full screen mode to maximize Camera Raw's interface. And before we dig too deeply into this dialog, I should let you know that PhotoshopCS6 actually has support for over 400 proprietary RAW formats. Every camera's vendor shoots in a RAW format if it's a high-end, what's known as a DSLR camera. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but DSLRs just mean they have changeable lenses. And they were very cost prohibitive early on, and even today can be quite expensive. My neighbor Mikkel is doing some Lightroom videos in the studio next door, and he's just bought a new $6,000 high-end camera. My Nikon N1 was only around $600. But my point-and-shoot cameras that I had before were in the $100 to $300 range. However, almost everyone has a camera on their smartphone these days, and this image was shot on an iPhone. I love the shot, the color, the composition, the sleeping child, the bright toy, but it's dark overall. In fact, Camera Raw shows you a histogram, a map of where the data lies in the image, and you can see there's a lot in the shadow or dark areas. There's a lot in the midtones, things that are in middle gray or hover around 50%. But I'm missing highlights. These bright bunny ears or whites really aren't opened up. To explain a few formats that are RAW to begin with, the ones I ran across first were CRW, CR2, .dng, .nef. NEF is a Nikon-branded Camera Raw image. .raw or .rw2. And actually, CRW and CR2 are Canon-branded. I find in America, people are usually Canon folks or Nikon folks. Now, looking at this image is raw or unprocessed. In fact, JPEGs and TIFFs can use the Camera Raw features even though they weren't shot in RAW. A JPEG or a TIFF you could think of like a photographic print. It's already been processed. But the RAW formats that I mentioned earlier are the closest thing you can get to a digital negative because they're unprocessed. You can use Adobe's Camera Raw dialog to process them, or there are other vendors that actually sell RAW processing applications. In any case, whether it be on my high-end camera, on my point-and-shoot consumer class camera, one that doesn't have changeable lenses, or on my phone, the Camera Raw dialog from Adobe will make the image far better all in one spot, without having to do 3 to 5 adjustment layers, or go to 3 or 5 different dialogues in Photoshop. Here's how. If I take exposure and slide it down, it's like lab developing where you were using chemicals, where you can expose it for a longer time or a shorter time to get a brighter image or a darker image. So exposure immediately makes the biggest improvement on images, and that's the dial that I start with first. As you learn about color, you'll learn to watch for impurities or color casts. I can see that the blue is missing a bit. It's low here. Or, depending on your values, I'm looking at red, green, and blue. I might need more blue to make this a neutrally balanced image. I've learned over time in a perfect white, the red and green and blue values are roughly even. So, if I add a little bit more blue and move into the ear, my goal would be to get all three numbers the same. Let's just average them, 223, 223, 223. Right now I've got a little bit more green and a little bit more red than I have blue. So I could add a hair more blue, and depending on where you sample, they're getting much closer. If I turn preview off and on, I've made a radical improvement with just those small moves. But wait, there's more. I can improve contrast by sliding to the right. And when I dial contrast up, I often like to turn preview off and on to see it. In fact, I'll dial exposure down so you can see just more of what contrast is doing. I should also mention it helps to go to 100% for your zoom level. Now when I do before and after, you can see overall the color is definitely better. But as I dial contrast down, the image gets flat and gray. Dial contrast up, all the colors richen up, and I get a bigger difference between the dark of her eyelashes and the light of her skin. Before, after. Now these dials get sophisticated, but in simplistic view, I can make my highlights lighter or protect them by sliding to the left. In fact, in Camera Raw 7, the newest version of Camera Raw in PhotoshopCS6, these dials all work the same way. This way goes darker, this way goes lighter. Shadows, darker or lighter. Lighter shadows will actually open up all the shadow detail. If they're dark and I really don't want to see the car seat she's in, that's a great way to focus on just the face. I can take the whites, lighter, which means I've got some clipping. I'm completely blowing out the highlight detail here. All 255s means no data. All lights on, and I've got no detail. As I pull the whites back down, now you could see all the detail in the little outfit. So you want to avoid seeing all 255s ever in your light areas. And I could boost the blacks, richen up things that are the darkest. Now I'm ready, when I turn preview off and on, a gray cloud has disappeared, but I'm ready to brighten the exposure a bit. And you'll find the more you play with this, the more you get used to the dials and find out what works for you. I like more natural corrections. I don't like too much contrast so that the image looks artificial. So here between before and after, overall I've made the color better, the contrast better, and all the tone is better. If I hit this little highlight clipping warning, I could see I lost some detail in these highlights, but this slider will protect them. Now I've lost no detail in the highlight, so I could safely turn that warning off. If I slide this up, you'll notice that I get spikes here, and then I could turn back on the warning to see what's peeking out or being destroyed by me moving my sliders too far. The last two sliders I'll show you outside of color temperature, exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, which to me are fairly logical, is clarity and vibrance. Clarity is like contrast, but it just makes a sharper, more clear picture. If I turn preview off and on, or if you take clarity to 0, see that huge shift? Now I'm going to type in a number but use tab so I don't say OK. I'll type in 10 and you'll see the difference. 0, Now 10. I don't even need to hit tab to jump out of it. It instantly updates. Now let's go from 0 to 20. There, I could see a lot more detail, but for me that may be a little artificial and her skin may be getting a little bit too grainy. So I like something like 5 or 10. And play with these numbers. Everybody's preference is individual and unique here. Lastly, if I want richer colors, Vibrance does a gorgeous job. If I take Vibrance to 0, you could see how these rich tones are flat. Again, if I type 10 and go back to 0, not a big difference. But let's try 30. There you could see a boost just happened. Back to 0, watch these blues and the orange when I type it. Flatter. I like 30 here, and Vibrance is a lot safer than it was in earlier versions. Finally, I'll take saturation up or down. Saturation basically means piling more ink on. So more pixels on top of one another on a printing press or your inkjet, more ink on top of one another. And I warn against saturation. I feel it can make the image look too fake too fast. You can see that it's really fake and artificial looking now. But if I put that back to 0, nice and realistic with boosted colors. Saturation can be used for special effects, kind of a faded or washed out photo. If you're doing advertising and you want to give the feeling of age, this is a good effect. And in fact, saturation to 0 goes to black and white. So it's a great way to start playing with the dials and get a very rich black and white image. In fact, instead of sliding that back, you could double click on any dial to reset it to its out-of-the-box or factory position. I'll slide these up just a little bit, and finally, I'll hit Done. And if I take a bigger look at Preview, I'll double-click on Metadata to collapse it. I'll scoot this over. Here is my corrected image. Before I show before and after, I'll go to Edit, Develop Settings, Copy, Edit, Develop Settings, Clear. You can't undo and redo Camera Raw settings, but you can copy and paste them. So basically, in the preview, this is the unretouched raw iPhone image. Edit, Develop Settings, Paste. Click OK. That's the after. If I try undo, it just undid a file naming that I had done before my example. So the way to see before and after is Edit, Develop Settings, Clear, Before, Edit, Develop Settings, Paste. Click OK, After. A far better image. Try this with one of your own images. Select it, choose File, Open in Camera Raw. It can be TIFF, it can be JPEG, it can be something shot in RAW. Images shot in RAW, when you double-click Open the RAW dialog automatically. So my goal with this video was to show you that I've made a correction that is non-destructive to this image. I can copy and paste those corrections to other images or clear them out to see before and after. And when I'm all finished, I double-click, hit Open Image, and now I can begin any Photoshop work that I need to do. And I would save as a PSD. That way it's uncompressed data. I'm not re-JPEGing it, and I have this shot as if I had perfect lighting, perfect settings on my camera, a better image than you would get just with an out-of-the-box smartphone camera. Give these techniques a try on your own images.